The metallic screech of Japanese dive bombers pierced the humid air above Henderson Field. As Marine Corporal Jimmy Martinez pressed his face into the coral dust, praying the earth would swallow him whole, it was August 7, 1942, and the first Allied offensive against the Empire of Japan had begun with the thunder of naval guns and the desperate cries of men who suddenly realized they were fighting for more than just an obscure island in the Solomon chain. Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift watched through his binoculars as the first wave of Marines splashed ashore on the northern beaches of Guadalcanal, their landing craft grinding against the black volcanic sand. The intelligence reports had been wrong again. What was supposed to be a lightly defended construction site revealed itself as a strategic prize that would define the entire Pacific War. The Japanese had been building an airfield, nearly complete, that could dominate the sea lanes between Australia and America. The morning sun cast long shadows across the coconut groves as Marines advanced inland, their Springfield rifles gleaming with sweat and salt water. According to recent analysis from the Naval History and Heritage Command, the multi-phase naval battle of Guadalcanal consisted of a series of destructive air and sea engagements closely related to a Japanese effort to reinforce land forces on the island. But on this first day, the complexity of what lay ahead remained hidden beneath the deceptive quiet of an apparently abandoned airstrip. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Goetsch led his reconnaissance patrol through the dense jungle, unaware that Japanese Colonel Kiyotake Kawaguchi was already planning a counterattack that would turn the island into a graveyard. The Marines had taken the airfield, soon to be renamed Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, killed at Midway, but holding it would prove far more difficult than capturing it. As the tropical day wore on, the true nature of their situation became clear. They were isolated on a hostile island, surrounded by enemy-controlled waters, dependent on supply lines that stretched across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. The Japanese controlled the seas by night, landing reinforcements and supplies in what would become known as the Tokyo Express, fast cruiser and destroyer runs that would make every sunset a herald of potential disaster. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, understood the strategic importance of Guadalcanal better than many Allied commanders. From his flagship, he coordinated a response that would commit the cream of the Imperial Navy to retaking what the Americans had seized. The stage was set for a campaign that would consume ships, planes, and men in quantities that would have been unimaginable just months before. By nightfall on August 7th, the Marines had established a perimeter, but they could already hear the distant rumble of Japanese naval guns. Radio reports filtered in of enemy ships moving through the narrow waterway between the Solomon Islands that would become known as Iron Bottom Sound for all the warships that would soon litter its depths. The battle for Guadalcanal had begun, and neither side yet understood that the outcome would determine not just control of the South Pacific, but the entire trajectory of the war against Japan. The darkness of August 8th brought with it the thunder of 16-inch guns. As Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser force descended upon the unsuspecting Allied fleet, anchored off Savo Island, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's transport ships sat vulnerable in the moonless night, their precious cargo of Marines and supplies still being unloaded. When the Japanese attack commenced with devastating precision, Captain Howard Bode aboard the USS Chicago never saw the Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes that transformed the night into a hellscape of exploding ships and burning men. The Battle of Savo Island lasted barely 30 minutes, but in that brief span, the Imperial Navy demonstrated why they ruled the Pacific darkness. For Allied heavy cruisers USS Astoria, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, and HMAS Canberra went to the bottom along with over 1,000 sailors. Admiral Turner faced an impossible decision as dawn approached on August 9th. His transports had been forced to withdraw before completing their unloading, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal with barely 4 days of supplies and no promise of resupply. Major General Alexander Vandegrift found himself commanding 17,000 Marines, who were effectively marooned on a hostile island with a partially built airfield as their only strategic asset. The Japanese response came swiftly. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the 17th Army, dispatched Colonel Kiyotake Kawaguchi with 900 men of the Ichiki detachment to eliminate what Tokyo still believed was merely a reconnaissance force. The Japanese high command, drunk on their string of victories across the Pacific, could not conceive that the Americans would commit to a major campaign in the Solomons. Colonel Ichiki Kiyono's men landed east of the marine perimeter on August 18th, confident that a single banzai charge would sweep the Americans into the sea. They had not reckoned with the defensive preparations of Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, dug in along the banks of Alligator Creek, though it was actually the Ilu River, a mistake in maps that would persist throughout the campaign. The attack came before dawn on August 21st. Ichiki's men charged across the sand spit at the river mouth, their battle cries echoing across the water as they ran directly into interlocking fields of machine gun fire. Marine Gunnery Sergeant John Basalone, manning a Browning M1917 machine gun, cut down wave after wave of Japanese soldiers until his weapon barrel glowed red-hot in the darkness. As the sun rose on August 21st, the beach was carpeted with Japanese dead. Colonel Ichiki, realizing the magnitude of his miscalculation, burned his regimental colors and committed suicide by his samurai sword. Of his 900 men, fewer than 30 survived to retreat into the jungle. The Americans had won their first major ground victory against Japanese forces, but they paid for it with the knowledge that their enemy would literally fight to the death rather than surrender. The victory at the Tanaru River, as the Americans called it, proved that Japanese soldiers were not invincible, but it also revealed the fanatical determination that would characterize every subsequent engagement. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reading the battle reports in Pearl Harbor, understood that Guadalcanal had become far more than a tactical objective. It was now a test of national will between two implacable enemies. The Grumman Wildcats of marine fighting. Squadron 223 roared down Henderson Field's Coral Runway on August 20th, 1942, marking the beginning of what would become known as the Cactus Air Force. Major John Smith's pilots had flown their F-4F fighters off the deck of the escort carrier USS Long Island, but landing on the unfinished airstrip felt more dangerous than any combat mission they had ever flown. Captain Marion Carl, who would become one of the war's leading aces, discovered that aerial combat over Guadalcanal followed different rules than the training manual suggested. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters that dominated Pacific skies were faster and more maneuverable than American aircraft, but they lacked armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst from a Wildcat's .650 caliber machine guns could turn a zero into a fireball. The strategic importance of Henderson Field became apparent as soon as American aircraft began operating from its crude runway. Japanese supply convoys, previously immune to attack during daylight hours, now faced constant harassment from marine dive bombers and fighters. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commanding the 11th Air Fleet from Rabaul, found his carefully orchestrated supply system disrupted by a handful of American pilots flying obsolescent aircraft from a barely functional airfield. Colonel Kiyotake Kawaguchi received orders from Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake to eliminate Henderson Field with a coordinated assault from 3 directions. His plan, refined during weeks of jungle movement, called for diversionary attacks from the east and west while his main force struck from the south through the supposedly impenetrable jungle ridges that the Marines had left lightly defended. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, sensing the approaching storm, repositioned his forces throughout early September. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines had arrived as reinforcements, bringing Marine strength to nearly 19,000 men. But ammunition remained critically short, and every Japanese air raid threatened to destroy the aircraft that provided their only offensive capability. The Japanese attack began on the night of September 12th with a massive naval bombardment from battleships Kongo and Haruna. Their 14-inch guns systematically destroyed most of Henderson Field's aircraft and turned the runway into a Cratered moonscape. For Marines huddled in their foxholes, the bombardment seemed to last forever, though it actually continued for only 90 minutes as the naval guns fell silent. Colonel Kawaguchi's infantry emerged from the jungle south of the airfield. His men had spent weeks cutting through nearly impenetrable vegetation, hauling artillery pieces and supplies along trails that existed only in their imagination. The approach march had cost him nearly half his strength to disease, exhaustion, and desertion, but those who remained were the elite of the Imperial Army. The Battle of Edson's Ridge began before midnight on September 13th. Paratroop Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Raider Battalion occupied the low coral ridge that dominated the southern approaches to Henderson Field, supported by elements of the 1st Parachute Battalion under Major Robert Williams. These units, elite formations in their own right, found themselves facing the cream of Japanese infantry in a contest that would determine control of the entire South Pacific. Kawaguchi's men attacked in waves, their battle cries echoing across the ridges they charged uphill against deeply entrenched Marines. The fighting was savage, often hand-to-hand, with Marines using bayonets, knives, and entrenching tools when their ammunition ran low. Colonel Edson, wounded early in the battle, continued directing the defense from a shell crater, his calm voice on the radio providing steady reassurance to his embattled companies. The second night of the Battle of Edson's Ridge dawned with the stench of credite and death hanging over the coral formations like a suffocating blanket. Colonel Merritt Edson's raiders had held through the first Japanese assault, but barely, and everyone knew that September 14th would bring a renewed attack with even greater ferocity. Colonel Kiyotake Kawaguchi had reorganized his surviving forces during the brief daylight respite, understanding that failure to take Henderson Field would mean the destruction of his entire command. His men, elite soldiers of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, Kawaguchi Detachment, prepared for what they believed would be their final assault. The Bushido Code demanded death before dishonor, and there could be no retreat from this ridge. Marine Private First Class Joseph Champagne, barely 18 years old and fighting in his first major battle, crouched in his foxhole as Japanese artillery began the preliminary bombardment. The shells, fired from mountain guns laboriously hauled through the jungle, fell with methodical precision across the Marine positions. Each explosion sent coral fragments spinning through the air like deadly confetti, and the screams of wounded Marines punctuated the mechanical rhythm of incoming rounds. As darkness fell on September 14th, the intensity of the Japanese attack surpassed anything the Marines had previously experienced. Kawaguchi's men came forward in human waves, their voices raised in traditional battle cries that echoed off the jungle canopy. They carried bamboo spears alongside modern rifles, emblematic of an army caught between ancient traditions and modern warfare. Colonel Edson, his uniform torn and bloodied from the previous night's fighting, moved constantly along his defensive line, appearing wherever the Japanese pressure seemed strongest. His calm demeanor under fire inspired Marines who were beginning to doubt whether they could hold another assault. Radio communication with divisional headquarters had been severed by artillery fire, leaving the raiders isolated on their coral fortress. The critical moment came near midnight when a concentrated Japanese assault broke through the Marine perimeter at what would later be called the Gap. For nearly an hour, it appeared that Kawaguchi's men might reach Henderson Field, but Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, a Solomon Islands native serving as a scout, crawled through Japanese lines despite severe bayonet wounds to bring word of enemy troop movements. Major Kenneth Bailey's company, positioned on the eastern slope of the ridge, found themselves surrounded as Japanese infiltrators worked their way through the Marine positions. Bailey, who had earned the Navy Cross at Tulagi, led a desperate counterattack that restored the perimeter at the cost of his own life. His Marines, many of them teenagers fighting their first battle, held their ground because retreat meant abandoning their wounded comrades. The tide turned when Marine artillery, directed by forward observers who had maintained communication despite the chaos, began laying concentrated fire on Japanese assembly areas. The pack howitzers of Lieutenant Colonel Pedro Del Vail's 11th Marines had been pre-registered on likely avenues of approach, and their shells fell with devastating accuracy. among Kawaguchi's reserve formations. As dawn broke on September 15th, the sounds of battle gradually subsided to the groans of wounded men and the crackle of burning vegetation. Colonel Kawaguchi, his force reduced to fewer than 800 effective soldiers, began the long retreat through the jungle toward the coast. Behind him on Edson's Ridge, the Marines counted their dead and wondered how they had managed to survive the night. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, visiting the battlefield after the Japanese withdrawal, found Edson sitting calmly on a coral outcrop, cleaning his rifle as if he had just returned from a training exercise. The colonel's apparent nonchalance masked the knowledge that his raiders had fought one of the most critical battles in Marine Corps' history, preserving Henderson Field and the entire Guadalcanal campaign through sheer determination and superior defensive positions. The waters between Guadalcanal, Savo Island, and Cape Esperance had already earned their grim nickname by October 1942, but the worst naval carnage still lay ahead. Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey had replaced Admiral Robert Gormley as South Pacific Commander, bringing with him an aggressive fighting spirit that matched the desperate circumstances facing American forces in the Solomons. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and supreme naval strategist of the Imperial Navy, understood that time favored the Americans. Their industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm Japanese forces, unless decisive action severed the Allied supply lines to Guadalcanal. He committed his most powerful fleet elements to Operation Ka, the final push to retake Henderson Field and eliminate American presence in the South Pacific. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's bombardment force centered on the fast battleships Hiei and Kirishima, whose 14-inch guns could devastate Henderson Field more thoroughly than any previous attack. Supporting them were cruisers and destroyers loaded with the elite soldiers of Lieutenant General Tadashi Maruyama's 2nd Division, men who had conquered Singapore and the Dutch East Indies. Rear Admiral Daniel Callaghan's Task Force 67 intercepted the Japanese fleet in the early hours of November 13th, leading to one of the most confused and savage naval battles in history. The darkness, rain squalls, and close quarters reduced the engagement to a melee where ship identification became nearly impossible and friendly fire casualties mounted. Alongside those inflicted by the enemy, the USS Atlanta, flagship of Rear Admiral Norman Scott, found herself caught between opposing battle lines as the two fleets interpenetrated. In the narrow waters off Savo Island, Japanese Type 93 torpedoes, more advanced than any American weapon, struck with devastating effect while American 5-inch guns hammered Japanese destroyers. At point-blank range, Admiral Callahan died on the bridge of his flagship, USS San Francisco, when a Japanese battleship salvo demolished the cruiser's superstructure. His last radio transmission, "We want the big ones, get the big ones," became legendary among American sailors, epitomizing the aggressive spirit that characterized the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Despite overwhelming odds, the battleship Hiei, pride of the Imperial Navy and veteran of Pearl Harbor, suffered catastrophic damage from concentrated American gunfire. Admiral Abe, wounded and seeing his flagship ablaze, ordered the bombardment mission abandoned. Instead of the systematic destruction of Henderson Field that Yamamoto had planned, the Americans had traded their entire task force for the preservation of their airfield. Dawn of November 13th revealed Iron Bottom Sound littered with sinking warships from both navies. The Americans had lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, while Japanese losses included a battleship, 2 destroyers, and numerous damaged vessels. More importantly, the planned bombardment of Henderson Field had been prevented, allowing Marine and Navy aircraft to continue operating from their coral runway. Enterprise aircraft, flying from the carrier's position south of the Santa Cruz Islands, found the crippled Hiei attempting to escape northward and subjected her to repeated bombing attacks throughout November 13th. The great battleship, designed to withstand naval gunfire, proved vulnerable to aerial attack, and she finally sank that evening with most of her crew. But Yamamoto was not finished. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's 2nd Bombardment Force, built around the battleship, Kirishima and heavy cruisers Atago and Takao approached Guadalcanal on the night of November 14th. This time, Rear Admiral Willis Lee's Task Force 64 waited with the new battleships Washington and South Dakota, marking the first time American battleships had engaged their Japanese counterparts since the war began. The Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal proved that American industrial might was beginning to match Japanese tactical skill. The Washington's radar-directed 16-inch guns found their targets in the darkness, reducing Kirishima to a burning wreck within minutes. The age of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific was ending, though few on either side yet realized the significance of what had occurred in those violent November nights. December 1942 brought a different kind of warfare to the waters around Guadalcanal, as Japanese destroyers, dubbed the Tokyo Express by Allied forces, attempted increasingly desperate supply runs to their starving garrison. Captain Tame Ichihara aboard the destroyer Shigeru had perfected the art of high-speed nocturnal missions, but American air power and naval forces were making each run more hazardous than the last. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army from Rabaul, faced an impossible logistical equation. His forces on Guadalcanal required tons of supplies daily merely to survive, but American control of Henderson Field meant that conventional transport ships could not approach the island during daylight hours. The solution, fast destroyer runs under cover of darkness, could carry only a fraction of needed supplies. Major Gregory Pappy Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron, Marine Fighting Squadron 114, had arrived at Henderson Field in September with a collection of war-weary Corsair fighters and pilots who had been written off as misfits by conventional military standards. Their unorthodox tactics and aggressive flying style proved perfectly suited to the chaotic environment of the Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese supply crisis reached critical proportions when Lieutenant General Tadashi Maruyama's 2nd Division attempted their final offensive in late October. His soldiers, reduced to eating grass and tree bark, attacked American positions with desperate courage, but lacked the strength to sustain their assault. The failure of this last major ground offensive marked the beginning of the end for Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. Captain Yasuhiro Shibuya's destroyer flotilla attempted a supply run on the night of December 3rd, carrying sealed drums filled with rice, ammunition, and medical supplies that could be quickly pushed overboard near the beach for recovery by Japanese soldiers. This improvised system, known as Rat Run supplies, demonstrated how far Japanese logistics had deteriorated since the confident days of August. Marine Corsair pilot Captain Kenneth Walsh, flying from Henderson Field, intercepted Japanese supply drops with increasing frequency as American air strength grew throughout December. The addition of Army Air Force units, including the veteran pilots of the 13th Air Force, meant that Japanese aircraft faced constant harassment during both day and night operations. The strategic situation had reversed completely from the campaign's opening months, where Japanese forces had once controlled the seas around Guadalcanal. American naval power now dominated both day and night operations. Rear Admiral Carleton Wright's cruiser force regularly intercepted Japanese supply convoys, though night surface actions remained hazardous for both sides due to superior Japanese torpedo technology. Emperor Hirohito, briefed on the deteriorating situation by Admiral Yamamoto, authorized the evacuation of Japanese forces from Guadalcanal in early January 1943. Operation K, as the withdrawal was designated, would attempt to salvage what remained of the 17th Army under cover of a deception plan, suggesting renewed offensive operations. The evacuation began on January 14, 1943, with destroyer runs that prioritized personnel over equipment. Captain Hara and his fellow destroyer skippers demonstrated exceptional seamanship in extracting soldiers from beaches under constant American air attack, but they were forced to abandon most heavy equipment and supplies. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, preparing to turn over command to Major General Alexander Patch, recognized that the Japanese withdrawal represented more than a tactical victory. According to recent historical analysis, By the end of 1942, it was clear that Japan had lost the Guadalcanal campaign, a serious blow to Japan's strategic plans for the defense of their empire, and an unanticipated defeat at the hands of the Americans. The psychological impact would prove as important as the military consequences. The last Japanese soldiers evacuated Guadalcanal on February 7, 1943, ending 6 months of combat that had transformed both armies. The Americans had learned to fight in the jungle, coordinate complex amphibious operations, and match Japanese tactical excellence with superior logistics and firepower. For Japan, Guadalcanal represented the first major defeat in a war they had expected to win quickly and decisively. On February 9, 1943, Major General Alexander Patch sent a message to Admiral William Halsey that would echo through history. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The simple words marked the end of the first major Allied offensive against Japan and the beginning of a strategic transformation that would carry American forces across the Pacific to Tokyo Bay. The statistics of the Guadalcanal campaign revealed the true cost of victory in the Pacific War. American forces had suffered approximately 7,000 casualties, including 1,600 killed in action, while Japanese losses exceeded 24,000 dead, with countless more evacuated. In critical condition, the naval losses on both sides, 24 major warships, each represented a devastation of fleet strength that neither navy could easily replace. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing after-action reports in Pearl Harbor, identified the critical factors that had enabled American victory despite initial Japanese advantages. The rapid construction and defense of Henderson Field had provided the strategic pivot around which the entire campaign revolved. Without that airbase, American naval forces could never have challenged Japanese control of the Solomon Islands sea lanes. The development of effective close air support techniques had emerged from the desperate circumstance. East of the campaign's early months, Marine dive bomber pilots like Major Richard Fleming and Captain Marion Caro had learned to coordinate with ground forces in ways that no peacetime training could have taught, creating tactical innovations that would be refined and employed throughout the Pacific War. Japanese strategic planning had revealed fatal flaws that would plague their military efforts. For the remainder of the war, the piecemeal commitment of forces, based on consistent underestimation of American capabilities and determination, had allowed a relatively small Marine force to defeat much larger Japanese armies. Through superior position and logistics, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, evacuated during the final destroyer runs, would later write that Japanese forces had been defeated not by American tactical superiority, but by their inability to sustain operations across extended supply lines. The industrial capacity of the United States, barely mobilized during the Guadalcanal campaign, represented a strategic advantage that Japanese planners had failed to appreciate fully. The campaign had also demonstrated the evolution of amphibious warfare from a theoretical concept to practical reality. Major General Alexander Vandegrift's Marines had pioneered techniques for establishing and maintaining beachheads against determined opposition, lessons that would prove invaluable in subsequent operations from Tarawa to Iwo Jima. Perhaps most significantly, Guadalcanal had shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility that had dominated Pacific War psychology since Pearl Harbor. American soldiers, sailors, and Marines had proven they could match Japanese courage and tactical skill, while bringing superior firepower and logistics to bear on extended operations. The technological innovations emerging from 6 months of combat would reshape naval and aerial warfare for the remainder of the Pacific conflict. Radar-directed gunfire, coordinated fighter sweeps, and integrated air-ground operations had all been tested and refined in the crucible of Guadalcanal combat. As American forces prepared for their next objective in the Central Pacific, the lessons learned on Guadalcanal provided the foundation for a new style of warfare. The island-hopping campaign that would carry American forces to Japan had been born in the coral dust of Henderson Field and the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound. The Guadalcanal campaign had taught the Allies how to defeat Japan Through a combination of strategic patience, tactical innovation, and overwhelming material superiority, the Japanese Empire, which had seemed invincible in December 1941, had revealed the vulnerabilities that would ultimately lead to its destruction. The road to Tokyo had begun with a handful of Marines clinging to a crude airstrip on an obscure island, and it would end less than 3 years later with Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay.